So now I'd like to move on. Since I was in book publishing for a long time, I'm always curious about how books, each individual book does come to be published. It's always a little bit of a story. So I want to ask each of the three authors how your books came to be published. Particularly, they have some particularly interesting publishing stories. And Danuda's was published by a Christian house, and I was asking her about that before. And it's a Christian house that has as its epigraph on the copyright page, the Lord gave the word, and great was the company of those who published it, from the Psalms. So it's a little bit of an arrogant epigraph for a publisher, but I thought it was interesting, and I thought it was interesting that they chose to publish this book. So, Danuda, why don't you start in talking about how your book was published, and then I'd like to hear from you, Robert and Stephen.
I always feel a little bit embarrassed when I talk about how the book was published, because the stories that I've heard from other writers is usually, oh, my book was rejected, 175 times, and finally someone took it. So when I was writing this book, I originally wrote it in Polish, and I decided to send it to Poland to my friend. He loved the book, and he said, you should translate it into English because, this really is about the United States of America. You should translate the book. So to make the long story short, I decided to translate it, and I discovered that I actually have a literary voice in English, which was wonderful. And I started writing in English exclusively after that. But I had 30 pages of this book. And I went to a public library in Elkridge. And I asked a person who was there, behind the desk, help desk. And I said, listen, can you help me with finding a publisher who would publish a book without an agent? And she said, oh, you just need to Google this. So she Googled it for me. And Tate Publishing came, they popped out. She said, why don't you try these guys? So I sent them 30 pages of my book, and they took it. And they said, send us the rest. And I said, I don't have the rest. And they said, we will wait for the rest. So I approached one publisher. They took it, and I did not look for anything else. I had an agent later on whom I met her friend on a plane flying from Poland to here. And she said, well, you should try with bigger houses. But I didn't understand, I guess, what it really means to publish a book, because this is my first novel. And I felt, how can I do it now? I already promised the book to someone else. And that would be just, unethical to say, guys, since we didn't sign the contract yet, I'm going somewhere else. I just felt that I couldn't do it. So yes, the first publisher I approached took the book. Oh, that's silly. I don't know.
Okay, well, that was a shorter story than I was expecting. Stephen, I hope you have something better for us.
Well, I wasn't rejected 176 times. 107. I went a little bit, in a way, the more traditional route, where I'd written the book, and I had other publishing. I did have something published once before, but because this is more mass market fiction, it's a very hard sell. It's more traditional. It's much more competitive. And I have my file cabinet with all the rejection slips, and I set it aside for a while. And, it's again the story of it's who you know. And what's interesting is I'd set it aside for a little while, and I was talking to somebody who was associated with Loyola University here in town. And he comes over to me and says, well, we have a publishing track for the students. And I said, well, tell me about it. And he goes, well, we're teaching the kids how to become publishers, so we created a publishing house called Apprentice House. And we'd like to do your book. And I said to him, you've never read my book. And he said, okay, give me 3 chapters. So I quickly went home, looked over the 3 chapters again, the first 3. I polished it a little bit and gave him the first 3 chapters. And he said, okay, let me have the rest of it by the end of the summer. And so for years, it was the traditional submission rejection with very interesting critique. that was diametrically opposed to each other, where one agent would say, well, the characters are great, but the story's weak. And then I'd have, well, the characters are weak, but the story's great. So it's like, who do you believe, and do you make changes anyway? So I had my circle of friends and professional peers who gave me really positive feedback, and I did all the tweaking that I wanted and set it aside, and then this opportunity came up, like almost out of nowhere. And again, it was through networking, and it was quite a surprise, and I'm really pleased, obviously. But publishing has gotten to the point where it really is connections. How do you get somebody to invest in your work? And it's such a bottom line business these days, it's just really hard for traditional publishers to make that investment. So when you luck out and find somebody, you need to run with it.
Robert, please, I'd like to hear your publishing story.
My experience is entirely different. When you're writing a novel, there comes a point where you have to decide that it's finished. And when that point arrives, then you begin looking around for an agent and or a publisher. About 4 years ago, I decided my novel was finished, and following my wife's advice, who always says, if you're parking in a car somewhere, always go right up to the front of the place you want to go to. In other words, you want to start at the top. And if you're forced to move farther away, do that. So I started out with as many agents as I could, what do you call it, when you look for agents who were interested in multicultural issues. So there's a word for that. What do you call it? No, anyway, I looked for those, and anyway, the idea is, I think I'll make it clear. I got a list of those agents, and I began dealing only with the ones that would take email, because it's just too expensive, printing up 50 pages or whatever, and sending that with postage to send it back to you. The whole thing is totally inefficient. So that I started with the big publishers. All the agents, they all said, this looks interesting, but it's not for us. So then I started with the publishers, and the publisher says we don't take anything over the transom. In other words, you've got to have an agent. So in other words, you're stymied. So the next thing I did, having this being my second book, I went to Google and I looked up small publishers. Now, there are a lot of small publishers in this country and, for that matter, in the world. And again, I scanned for those, that's the word I was looking for, scanned for those that were interested in multicultural issues. And now I had a more compact list, and I began, again, dealing only with email, back and forth, and still wasn't making it. So I thought, well, maybe it's the novel. It's not the agents, not the publishers. So I have a very good friend who is a well-published author. I asked him to look at it. He said, sure. When he sent it back to me, in fact, he didn't send it back. He left it at one of our local libraries and asked me to pick it up there. Now, that was an omen, because when I opened that thing up, he had just slashed the hell out of it. So I called him on the phone. He said, I hope we're still friends. In fact, he left me a note with it. I hope we're still friends after this. And he said, look, just do this. Save only the parts that I didn't cut out and see how that works. Well, I have to say, it worked a whole lot better. And then, of course, I rewrote a number of parts of it, elaborated on some, and finally ended up with a manuscript that I thought was, by God, this has to be good. So, again, I sent out to these small publishers, and one day I got an email back that said, I've just finished reading your manuscript, and I'd like to publish it. Man, was that wonderful. And that's how it happened. And I should tell you that this was a publisher with headquarters in the UK and subsidiaries in the Netherlands and Panama. It was the man in Panama who sent me the email. And when we got talking on the phone, he said, I'm especially interested in having someone who is not from the United States experiencing the immigration problems that are in the United States. And that was what caught his interest.
Stephen, did you want to add something?
I think when you're in this kind of work, the arts, and you're trying to put your work out there and have somebody else validate it or buy it in a commercial situation is you have to understand that no is the standard answer. And you have to surround yourself with friends and family whom you trust so you can get some really good critique of, of opinions that you feel strongly about. And you just have to get past all those no's and weed out and find direction. And sometimes it goes more easily than others. And it's a long path sometimes, or in some cases shorter. But no, you have to trust your friends. You have to trust your instinct. Get some good critique. And I remember reading somewhere somebody saying about Hollywood that basically nobody knows anything about what's going to sell. So you really have to trust yourself.
I think those are very good points. Danuta?
I wanted to add something. Many of my friends and friends of their friends and friends of friends of friends read the book before it was published. And the best critique I received was from someone who said, "I hate the book because you make me love the hijacker, and I hate you for this." It was a friend of a friend, but when I received this feedback, I felt, this is what I wanted. I wanted you to like someone who you hate. And I hate them too. And I had to build a character that would be so human that you would say, I understand this guy even though I hate him so much that, yes, I can't even express how much I hate him. Right?